In the quiet stretch of forgotten centuries, far away from the clang of armor and the dusty bustle of market crowds, there existed a rhythm of life so slow, so predictable, and so comfortably uneventful that one could almost hear time yawn as it passed. Among the many aspects of life that unfolded in this gentle, unhurried manner, the art of dating, or whatever counted as dating in medieval times, moved with an especially sleepy pace. And so, if one ever wondered what dating was like in medieval times, the answer would drift like a soft, lazy breeze across the rolling meadows. It was slow, cautious, repetitive, and wrapped in so much polite hesitation that it could lull even the most restless spirit into drowsiness. This story begins in the small, unremarkable village of Woodhollow, known mostly for its modest fields, its quiet sheep, and the way everyone spoke in slightly hushed tones as though afraid of startling the wind. In this village lived a young man named Alaric, though there was nothing particularly remarkable about him except that he was the sort of person who always looked like he had just awakened from a nap. People often assumed he was sleepy because he worked long hours tending sheep, but the truth was that he simply moved gently through life, never in a hurry and never with much excitement. Alaric, like many others in Woodhollow, was reaching the age where people began to murmur soft comments about marriage. Not loudly, of course. No one in Woodhollow ever spoke loudly, but quietly, like two leaves whispering to each other before falling. The village had its own quiet customs about courting. There were no grand gestures, no passionate declarations, no sudden romances like minstrels liked to sing about. Instead, there were glances exchanged at markets, nods shared over hay bales, and very slow walks taken at carefully spaced distances so no one accidentally appeared too forward. Alaric, for his part, felt no rush. He enjoyed the slow steeping nature of his days. But the village, with its gentle insistence, nudged him forward in the softest possible way. One morning, when the clouds looked particularly sleepy, Alaric noticed a young woman named Elswith at the well. She was filling her bucket with the same calm deliberation that everyone else did, but Alaric happened to arrive just as she was tying the rope. And both found themselves in that most delicate of situations, standing somewhat near each other without having planned it. In medieval dating, this counted as monumental progress. Alaric nodded in a polite, slow rhythm, as though unsure how many times one was supposed to nod in such a scenario. Elswith offered a small smile. The kind one gave out of habit more than emotion, and they both resumed the quiet business of standing still. Eventually, Alaric remembered that medieval courting required him to offer help, but never in a way that seemed overly bold. So he cleared his throat softly, the quietest throat clear imaginable, before asking if she needed assistance carrying the bucket back home. Elswith considered this for a long moment, long enough for the bucket to drip several droplets back into the well. Then she nodded. And so they walked, not too close, mindful of propriety, and not too far, mindful of courtesy. Each step was measured, each silence stretched comfortably between them, and each moment passed with the kind of uneventfulness perfect for inducing sleep. In medieval times, dating rarely involved the individuals alone. Families, neighbors, curious onlookers, and the occasional old aunt with opinions all hovered nearby, metaphorically or literally, offering small nods of approval or disapproval like background decorations. Alaric knew that if word spread slowly, of course that he had walked beside Elswith for more than a dozen steps, then the village might begin to assume that something resembling intention was forming between them. But intention itself, in the medieval sense, was never expressed directly. It drifted like wandering fog without form or urgency. Over the next few weeks, Alaric and Elswith found themselves in equally slow, equally uneventful scenarios. They would arrive at the market at nearly the same time without truly meaning to. They'd pick up apples from the same basket, both inspecting them with more seriousness than apples required. Sometimes they would stand near the same sheep pen at the edge of town, quietly watching sheep do what sheep always did. Absolutely nothing interesting. And in the medieval world, this was practically a romantic experience. Their conversations, when they did occur, drifted like soft, muted clouds. Alaric would mention that the hay seemed particularly hay-like this season, and Elswith would agree in a tone suggesting deep contemplation. Sometimes, Elswith would remark that the weather had been mild, and Alaric would nod as though this was the most profound revelation he had heard in weeks. And through these slow exchanges, the kind that never rushed toward any conclusion, their courtship, in the medieval sense, gently formed. Dating in medieval times often required approval from families, though approval usually came in the form of long silences and a few raised eyebrows. Alaric's parents observed his gradual pattern of returning home with slightly softer footsteps, perhaps indicating he had enjoyed a conversation. They said nothing, simply acknowledging it with a gentle blink. Ellsworth's family, equally quiet, noticed that she occasionally hummed while she spun wool. Not loudly, of course, but just barely enough for someone nearby to detect. This subtle change was considered borderline dramatic in Woodhollow. The next step in medieval dating involved subtle gift exchanges. Not grand, elaborate gifts, those were reserved for nobles and troubadours with too much free time, but small, practical items. Alaric, after much internal debate, chose to give Ellsworth a ribbon. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't brightly colored. It wasn't anything that called attention to itself. It was simply a ribbon, modest and functional, the type one could use to tie hair back or secure a small bundle of herbs. Presenting it, however, required ceremonial awkwardness. Alaric approached Ellsworth near the sheep field and gently held out the ribbon with two hands, as if offering a relic. Ellsworth accepted it with equal solemnity, her expression unchanged but her eyes blinking with what might have been gratitude, or perhaps she simply had dust in her eyes. One could never be sure. Days passed, then weeks, with this slow, nearly motionless dance of medieval romance. On feast days, the two would sit at similar distances near the communal fire, but not too close, maintaining the respectful gap that let everyone know they were neither strangers nor inappropriately familiar. Sometimes Alaric would comment on the warmth of the fire, and Ellsworth would note that fires were indeed warm. The conversations were predictable, the silences comfortable, and the connection, though soft and understated, grew with the patience of moss on a stone. Occasionally, the local matchmaker, a woman whose entire job involved nodding thoughtfully and making vague comments, would pass by them. She never interfered, never spoke loudly, and never rushed conclusions. She simply watched their quiet interactions with the eyes of someone who knew that slow courtships were the ones that tended to last, mostly because they took so long to begin that ending them would require too much effort. One afternoon, as the seasons prepared to shift in the dullest way possible, Alaric decided it might be time to move their courtship into its next stage, asking if he might accompany Ellsworth on a slightly longer walk. In medieval dating, this was an enormous step-long walks, allowed people to exchange even more observations about weather, crops, sheep, and the general state of village life. So Alaric approached Ellsworth near the well once more, cleared his throat in that same gentle fashion, and asked if she might like to walk with him along the path toward the outer fields. Ellsworth considered this, not with shock or excitement, but with the calmness of someone evaluating whether the air was suitable for drying laundry. Then she nodded. The walk itself was uneventful in the most comforting way. The path wound through tall, soft grass that swayed lazily in the breeze. Birds chirped in unenthusiastic patterns, as though they, too, preferred a slow and steady tune. Alaric remarked that the grass had grown higher than he remembered, and Ellsworth responded that grass did tend to grow. They discussed the likelihood of rain, the sturdiness of fences, the mildness of winters, and the softness of wool. Their steps were unhurried, their pace steady, and the world around them seemed to settle into the same drowsy rhythm. In medieval times, there were no dramatic declarations of love. Instead, shared walks, exchanged glances, gifted ribbons, and mutual acknowledgments of weather conditions formed the foundation of affection. And gradually, quietly, inevitably, affection did grow between Alaric and Ellsworth. It was not a love that burned brightly. It was a love that glowed faintly, like a lantern with a soft flame that never flickered too high. A love that moved like warm honey, slow, steady, and soothing. When the time came for Alaric to speak with Ellsworth's family, it was done in the most predictable manner. He arrived at their door, removed his hat, dipped his head, and explained that he wished to formally continue courting their daughter. Her parents exchanged slow glances that were practically paragraphs in meaning, and after a long pause, nodded their approval. Ellsworth, who had been quietly spinning wool in the corner, looked up and blinked in acknowledgement. The continued courting lasted through the turning of seasons. Autumn fell softly. Winter arrived with gentle snows that muffled every sound, spring unfurled slowly, and summer drifted in with long, warm days perfect for quiet conversations in shaded areas. Through all this, Alaric and Ellsworth became closer not through excitement but through consistent, peaceful familiarity. They learned each other's thoughts in the spaces between words. They understood the meaning of each soft smile, each shared task, each moment of companionable silence. When Alaric finally asked for Ellsworth's hand, it was done during another soft afternoon near the sheep fields. He didn't kneel dramatically or present a lavish ring. Those were luxuries of nobles, not villagers. Instead, he simply stated, in his gentle voice, that he wished to spend his life with her, sharing quiet mornings and slow evenings and all the uneventful days in between. Ellsworth accepted with the same calmness, her eyes showing a faint warmth that was more meaningful than any grand gesture. Their wedding was a modest gathering of family and neighbors. No trumpets, no elaborate decorations, just simple garlands, shared bread, and a dance so slow that it looked more like two people shifting from foot to foot. Yet the joy, though quiet, was genuine. As the years passed, their life together looked much like their courtship. Slow, steady, predictable, and deeply peaceful. They tended their fields, raised children who inherited their quiet dispositions, and lived in harmony with the gentle rhythm of Woodhollow. Their love story, while uneventful, became something villagers whispered about fondly. Not because it was exciting, but because it was soothing, like a long, restful sigh stretched across a lifetime. And so, if one wished to understand what dating was like in medieval times, it was this: a long, slow drift toward companionship, built on patience, small gestures, soft-spoken words, and countless moments where silence said everything that needed to be said. It was not rushed, not dramatic, not filled with sweeping declarations. It was steady, deliberate, and comforting, like the unhurried turning of seasons, or the gentle creaking of an old wooden wheel. In the end, medieval dating was less about sparks and more about embers, quiet, glowing, enduring. And for many, including Alaric and Ellsworth of Woodhollow, that was more than enough. It was a life built on shared simplicity, shared routine, and the soft understanding that love, even in its most unremarkable form, could be profoundly peaceful. As the quiet years drifted on in Woodhollow, Alaric and Ellsworth settled into the gentle rhythm of married life. A rhythm so steady and so predictable that even the village cats seemed to nap more deeply in their presence. Their cottage, a small structure of timber and pale stones, stood at the edge of the fields where the wind always carried the soft smell of hay. The roof creaked lightly in the evenings, a sound almost like an old man clearing his throat politely, and the couple found comfort in its familiar murmurs. Life unfolded almost the same way each day, not because anything forced it to, but because the simplicity of medieval life naturally encouraged a repetition that soothed even the most restless souls. Every morning, the sun rose slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the sleepy village, and its light seeped into their room in long, narrow strips. Alaric always rose with a soft grunt, careful not to move too quickly, for haste was not something he practiced. Ellsworth rose shortly afterward, tying her hair with the same ribbon Alaric once gave her during their courtship. It had faded slightly over the years, but the gentle wear only made it feel more fitting for their unhurried world. They would begin their morning with porridge, always porridge, sometimes with a bit of honey when the bees had been cooperative, and sometimes plain when they had been less so. Most mornings involved small tasks that never changed much. Alaric would check on the sheep, who never offered surprises. Sheep in Woodhollow lived the same sort of quiet existence as humans did. They wandered slowly, grazed slowly, and occasionally bleated in tones that somehow sounded sleepy too. Ellsworth would tend to the garden, pulling weeds that seemed to grow exactly where she expected them to, as if weeds in Woodhollow respected routine as much as people did. She would plant herbs, check the vegetables, and ensure that everything was growing at the same steady pace as always. Neighbors often stopped by to exchange greetings or share news, though news in Woodhollow rarely meant anything urgent or dramatic. Someone might mention that a crow had landed on a fence they hadn't seen it land on before. Another might comment that this year's turnips were shaping up to be slightly rounder than the previous year. Such observations were treated with the seriousness of royal proclamations simply because they added the tiniest ripple to the still pond of everyday life. As for dating in medieval times, well, even after marriage, the essence of it lingered. Medieval couples did not transform overnight into new people. Instead, their courtship simply melted into their daily existence. Alaric and Ellsworth continued their slow walks, though now they felt free to walk closer together. They shared small remarks about the weather, the crops, and the sheep, just as they always had. Sometimes they spoke about the softness of wool or the sturdiness of boots. The conversations had no urgency and no destination. They drifted like leaves in a mild stream, guided by nothing but the pleasant passing of time. Evenings in their cottage were perhaps the sleepiest moments of all. After the day's tasks were completed, Alaric and Ellsworth would sit by the small hearth, watching the fire settle into its own slow rhythm. The flames crackled quietly, their light dancing lazily across the walls. Sometimes Alaric would sharpen a tool, not because it needed sharpening urgently, but because it was simply something to do with his hands. Ellsworth would spin wool, her wheel turning with a soft, hypnotic hum that blended perfectly into the peaceful hush of the room. Their life may have seemed uneventful to an outsider, but to them, every small detail carried meaning. A slightly fuller harvest, a new calf born without trouble, a snowfall that came earlier than expected. These little things offered the comfort of gentle variety, and in a world without hurry, each moment had space to breathe. As time went on, their family grew. Their first child, a girl named Lenora, entered the world on a quiet afternoon with a sky so pale it looked nearly asleep. She was a calm baby, rarely fussing, as if she instinctively understood the gentle rhythm of Woodhollow life. Alaric would hold her in the evenings, rocking her slowly, humming old village tunes that barely rose above a whisper. Ellsworth would smile, her spinning wheel turning at a steady pace, the room filled with warmth and predictable sounds. Later came a son named Enric, equally peaceful and content. The children grew up learning the same traditions their parents had once followed. They learned that courtship began with small gestures, slow conversations, and the gentle passing of seasons. They learned that love was not something sudden or loud, but something built patiently, like a well-maintained fence or a neatly stacked woodpile. As the children grew older, they too witnessed the quiet customs of medieval dating around them. They saw young villagers exchanging shy glances at the market, much like Alaric and Ellsworth once had. They saw ribbons given, baskets of apples shared, and long walks taken at cautious distances. And slowly, they recognized how love in Woodhollow unfolded not with bursts of excitement, but with the steady warmth of familiarity. Years continued to drift by, marked by harvests, first frosts, and the slow shifting of shadows through the village. Alaric and Ellsworth aged in the same peaceful manner they had lived, without rush, without upheaval, and without surprise. Their hair grayed softly, like frost settling on grass. Their steps grew slower, though they had never been fast to begin with. Their days remained predictable, and predictability to them was not dull but comforting. In the cool hours of dusk, Alaric often reflected on how dating had once seemed like such a delicate dance. He remembered the quiet well where he first walked beside Ellsworth, the way her eyes blinked softly when he gave her the ribbon, and the many silent moments that carried just as much meaning as words. He realized how every step of their courtship had shaped the slow, peaceful life they shared now. It had never been about excitement or passion. It had been about understanding, patience, and the gentle unfolding of kindness over time. Ellsworth occasionally reminisced too, though her memories floated through her mind like drifting feathers, touched lightly and never held too tightly. She remembered the awkwardness of those early conversations, the way they both commented on weather so often it almost became a ritual. She remembered how Alaric had walked beside her, always respectful, always steady. She remembered how that steadiness had become the foundation of their home and the quiet anchor of their life together. As their children grew into adulthood, they carried forward the same gentle traditions. Lenora met a young man named Ettrick at the bakery. Their first interaction involved both reaching for the same loaf of bread and then apologizing in whispers. Eventually, they shared long walks, spoke in soft tones about harvests and weather, and followed all the familiar patterns that formed medieval courtship. Emmerich, on the other hand, found companionship in a girl who visited the village from a nearby hamlet. Their conversations unfolded slowly, over shared work in the fields, and the occasional quiet afternoons spent watching clouds. In time, Alaric and Ellsworth became grandparents, and their cottage filled once more with soft voices and tiny footsteps. The children played with wooden toys, napped in warm corners, and listened to the calming stories of how courtship once worked in Woodhollow. Alaric would tell them about the ancient customs, how young people were never rushed, how they took months or even years to build the foundations of a relationship, and how every gesture, no matter how small, held meaning. The grandchildren found these customs fascinating in a slow, thoughtful way, nodding with the same gentle curiosity their grandparents had always shown. They often asked for stories about how Alaric and Ellsworth had met, stories that seemed almost too quiet to be called stories at all. And Alaric would describe the soft mornings, the shared glances, the long silences that spoke more than words, and the ribbon exchanged with such ceremonial awkwardness. Ellsworth would add her memories, always in the same mild, peaceful tone that had soothed their children before them. As the seasons continued their lazy rotation, the village of Woodhollow never changed much. New cottages might appear, old ones might settle slightly deeper into the earth, but the rhythm remained unbroken. The same slow courtships took place year after year, generation after generation, each one unfolding with patient gentleness. And the story of what dating was like in medieval times could always be found by watching these quiet dances between villagers who seemed to understand, instinctively, that love grew best when given time. Alaric and Ellsworth, now in the late autumn of their lives, often sat beside each other in their cottage doorway. They watched the sheep grazing, the children playing, and the sun drifting lazily toward the horizon. They rarely spoke during these moments, not because they had nothing to say, but because they no longer needed words. Their entire lives had been built on the soft language of silence, gestures, and steady companionship. And in these peaceful twilight hours, their story, once a slow and quiet courtship, felt like a long, warm blanket wrapped around the village itself. A reminder that in medieval times, dating was not a rush toward love but a gentle wandering, a tender unfolding, and an acceptance that the best things in life arrived slowly, like dawn creeping over the hills. As Alaric and Ellsworth continued to sit in their doorway during those long, mellow evenings, the village around them kept breathing in its unhurried way. The days blurred into each other like soft brushstrokes of the same color, and the world outside their cottage seemed to move slower with each passing season. Alaric often leaned his head slightly to the side, letting the breeze touch his face, while Ellsworth folded her hands neatly in her lap, the slightly frayed ribbon still tied in her hair after all those years. It fluttered just a little in the wind, looking as though time itself had grown fond of its gentle presence. Their lives were peaceful but not empty. Every day brought some small, calming task, repairing a fence post, tending to the garden, mending a woolen tunic, stirring a pot of stew that simmered for hours over a low fire. These weren't dramatic moments, nor did they aim to be. Sometimes in the late hours of the afternoon, Alaric would walk slowly to the market field. It wasn't a bustling place, just a few wooden stalls where farmers set down vegetables, herbs, and the occasional bundle of wool. He didn't need anything most days, perhaps a small bunch of carrots or a block of cheese, but he enjoyed the familiar faces and the familiar repetition. Neighbors would greet him with nods that lasted just long enough to be considered friendly. Someone might comment that the geese had been louder that morning. Someone else might remark that a new batch of beeswax candles had been made. None of it mattered much, and yet all of it mattered in the way small comforts do. Ellsworth occasionally accompanied him, moving with the same slow steadiness that had become her signature. Sometimes they walked side by side, other times a few paces apart, as if old habits of medieval propriety lingered in their steps. They still found joy in exchanging small remarks about the ripeness of tomatoes, the softness of wool, the shape of clouds drifting overhead. And there was something deeply reassuring in the fact that after so many years, nothing about these quiet exchanges felt routine. Instead, they felt like the familiar softness of a pillow well worn but always comforting. Their children, Lenora and Emmerich, now fully grown, had begun their own humble households in the village. Lenora and her husband lived only a short walk away, in a cottage much like her parents', comfortable, unassuming, warmed by the same quiet fires and the same gentle silences. Emmerich lived closer to the village center, where he worked in the fields and tended to livestock. Both families visited often, though never abruptly. Visits were announced by the slow crunch of footsteps on the garden path rather than surprise knocks. The grandchildren brought the softest kind of liveliness to the cottage. They weren't loud children. Perhaps something about Woodhollow naturally encouraged gentleness. They played in the yard with wooden toys carved by Emmerich from leftover bits of timber. They rolled small hoops, gathered stones near the stream, and frequently brought Ellsworth small bouquets of flowers, always simple flowers, like clover or tiny meadow blossoms that grew everywhere. When Alaric told the children stories, he didn't dramatize them. He spoke in the same low, steady voice he used for everything, making even the simplest tale sound like a slow river drifting downstream. The children often sat very still, listening to how dating had been when he was young. He explained that people in medieval times had no need for hurried romances or grand gestures, because life itself was long and slow. He told them how a small nod, shared at the right moment, carried the weight of entire conversations. The children listened with wide eyes, absorbing the idea that a simple ribbon or a slow walk could be more meaningful than anything else. Elswith told her own stories, usually while spinning wool. The wheel turned with a soothing whir that blended into the soft, quiet tone of her recollections. She told the children about the old customs, how neighbors used to watch courtships from afar with approving glances, how feast days brought everyone together under the warm glow of torches, how dances were slow and measured, so that no one tripped over their own excitement. She explained how people took their time because time in those days was something they had plenty of. The world moved at a pace set by the sun and the seasons, not by clocks or rushing expectations. As the grandchildren grew older, they too began noticing the early signs of quiet courtships among the village youth. A boy might help a girl carry a bucket of water, walking several careful steps behind her so as not to be too bold. A girl might leave a sprig of herbs on a doorstep, not with a note or announcement, but with the quiet hope that the gesture would be understood. These traditions, passed down like treasured heirlooms, continued to define the gentle rhythm of dating in Woodhollow. Meanwhile, the village itself remained nearly unchanged. The same cobblestone paths wound through the center. The same old well stood beneath the same leaning oak tree, its branches stretching lazily over the stones. The market field still hosted the same wooden stalls in the same spots they had been for decades. Even the sheep seemed to graze in the same patterns, moving with such unhurried grace that they could have been mistaken for part of the scenery. Years drifted along like soft clouds. Alaric's hair turned whiter, Elswith's hands grew softer with age, and their voices mellowed into gentle murmurs even quieter than before, yet neither felt the weight of time heavily. The slow pace of life made aging feel as natural as watching the seasons turn something observed rather than resisted. On certain evenings, when the sky was painted in muted shades of rose and violet, Elswith would rest her head lightly against Alaric's shoulder. They didn't need to speak to feel the fullness of their shared life. Their courtship had begun with silence, and it had blossomed through countless quiet gestures. Now, in their later years, that silence felt like a familiar embrace, as comforting as the soft wool Elswith spun or the warm bread she baked in the hearth. The villagers, especially the younger ones, often spoke of Alaric and Elswith as the embodiment of how dating once was, and how it should continue to be. Not hurried, not filled with unsteady passions, but steady, patient, and soft. Their story wasn't one told with excitement or drama, but with admiration for its peacefulness. It had become a quiet legend in Woodhollow, passed on gently from one generation to the next. Elswith would watch the last bit of daylight fade from the horizon, her fingers resting on the frayed end of her ribbon. The night eventually settled across Woodhollow, bringing with it a soft hush that blanketed the village like fresh snow. Lanterns flickered on doorsteps, fires softened into glowing embers, and people drifted into sleep with the same ease as leaves drifting to the ground. Alaric and Elswith would retreat indoors, closing the wooden door with a gentle push, the hinges creaking softly in acknowledgement. Their cottage became a warm pocket of calm in the stillness of night. The fire crackled faintly, casting long shadows that moved slowly across the walls. Their bed, piled with wool blankets Elswith had woven throughout the years, welcomed them with familiar softness. They would lie down, side by side, their breaths gradually sinking into a steady, peaceful rhythm, two lives that had always moved at the same gentle pace. And as they drifted into sleep, the village outside rested in its own quiet way, knowing that tomorrow would arrive just as softly as today had left. And so the quiet tale drifted on, settling deeper into its own slow rhythm, like soft dust gathering on an old wooden table in a long-abandoned hall. As the evenings in the medieval countryside grew cooler, people continued to move about their simple lives, rarely rushing, rarely pushing against the steady pace of the days. Life simply flowed. When the sun slipped behind the hills, the villagers finished whatever tasks remained, walked home in the calm dusk, and prepared for undemanding sleep. In those gentle hours after supper, when chores were finally done and the world seemed wrapped in muted darkness, the thoughts of the young and unmarried often drifted to the slow, subtle process of companionship, a process that was never hurried, never brightly lit, never bold, but instead as soft and muted as candlelight behind a shutter. In the small settlements scattered between forests and fields, there was a faint awareness that companionship might begin with just a shared task. Two people gathering herbs at the same patch of meadow might talk about the weather or the mild scent of wild mint. Their voices carried lightly on the breeze, unremarkable, nothing dramatic at all. And those conversations would linger in their minds long after they returned to their daily routines, becoming memories that neither hurried nor demanded anything. They simply existed, quiet and patient, waiting for the next meeting. Sometimes a young man might help repair a fence near a family's pasture, steadying each wooden post and tugging on loose lines of twine as he worked. A young woman might be nearby, collecting fallen apples or checking the condition of the chickens. Their exchanges, if any, were small and easily overlooked. Perhaps a simple greeting or a calmly spoken comment about the turning of the season. But in a world so slow and unhurried, even the smallest interactions could settle gently into the heart. The medieval world did not expect them to declare anything quickly. Instead, the possibility of companionship stretched over seasons. People might notice small details about one another, the way someone walked along the edge of the field, the way their voice sounded when speaking to an elder, or how patiently they waited their turn at the village well. These observations were not dramatic discoveries, just soft impressions building over time. And because days were so repetitive and slow, these impressions lingered, settling like quiet sediment. In towns where merchants gathered, things moved only slightly faster. A young apprentice might see the daughter of a baker each morning when she swept flour from the doorway. She might nod politely to him, and he might return the gesture with careful politeness. Days would pass this way, each one nearly identical to the last, until this routine became a comforting part of the mornings. And though neither of them might speak more than a few words at a time, the familiarity would grow in its own unhurried way, as though shaped by the slow grinding of millstones. And when families eventually spoke to one another about the possibility of a union, the discussions were practical and calm. They spoke not of passion or excitement, but of land boundaries, dowries, shared responsibilities, and mutual expectations. Even in these moments, the tone was never hurried. A mother might sit by the hearth, hands folded in her lap, discussing with a neighbor whether her daughter might be well suited to a certain household. Fathers might speak of ensuring their sons had a stable future. These conversations had the steady rhythm of life itself, predictable, unobtrusive, unembellished. And behind these formalities, the youths involved would continue their daily routines, feeling perhaps a mild flutter of curiosity about their potential future companion. Yet even that flutter was subdued, softened by the pace of the world they lived in. They would think calmly about how that person stacked firewood or how they carried water. They would picture their face illuminated by firelight rather than sunlight. But these thoughts drifted gently, never demanding attention, never rising in intensity. Season after season, fields were sown and harvested. Livestock wandered the same paths, markets set up and closed down. Life continued in its steady cycle, giving friendships, affections, and quiet understandings time to take shape. Even after arrangements were made and marriages held, love itself blossomed at the same slow pace. Couples learned to appreciate one another's quiet habits, how one might hum softly while kneading dough, or how the other might pause before speaking, carefully choosing each word. These discoveries were unremarkable yet comforting, forming the foundation of life together. People told stories of past generations, often mentioning how someone's grandparents had met by chance at a midsummer gathering, or how another pair first noticed each other at the edge of a communal harvest. The stories were never exciting, never filled with drama. Instead, they were told as gently as the original moments had unfolded, casual, calm, and only slightly romantic, in the way that simple memories can be when softened by time. As the centuries passed within this imagined medieval landscape, Each small thread of companionship wove itself into the greater tapestry of village life. It happened slowly and quietly, without fanfare, without sudden revelations. The village lanes remained the same, trodden by countless footsteps. The fields stretched endlessly, their colors shifting but their patterns unchanged. And through it all, the quiet habits of meeting, noticing, caring, and eventually building a life together drifted gently from one generation to the next. In these long, drowsy reflections, the world seemed wrapped in soft fabric-muted colors, muffled sounds, and a sense of calm so deep that every detail seemed to settle like dust motes in the golden light. And as the night deepened, as the wind slowed and the hearth embers dimmed, the story continued wandering forward, unhurried, peaceful, and endlessly patient, like a quiet medieval evening stretching gently towards sleep. And so the days continued in that same steady rhythm, as though the entire village were breathing in unison under the patient skies. The talk of courting and dating never really left anyone's mind, yet it never rose to any height of excitement either. It drifted like a thin wisp of chimney smoke present, noticeable but never urgent, as if the whole subject were content to wait until the people of the village were ready to address it in their own time. In the cool mornings, when the dew clung to every blade of grass, the villagers walked the same rutted paths they always had, nodding to one another in the same quiet ways. No one rushed, because rushing had no place in the long, slow rhythm of medieval life. If two young people were seen walking near each other, others might glance over with a mild sort of curiosity, but then return their eyes to their own tasks because even such glances felt like an indulgence. Courting was not a spectacle. It was a trickle, never a river. The village elders often said that dating in their youth was not much different. It had always been the way of things for a young man to find excuses to help a family, or for a young woman to linger a moment longer at the well, but beyond that, time itself did the deciding. There were no written rules that anyone followed. The customs existed only because they had always existed. A family might be asked whether a pairing seemed suitable. Neighbors might offer slow nods or small shrugs. And after enough time had passed, the couple might find themselves in something resembling an understanding, though the exact moment of agreement was hard to pinpoint. Evenings stretched on with the same deliberate slowness. Families sat by their hearths, sorting grains, mending tools, or simply sitting in silence, letting the fire's soft crackling fill the gaps where conversation could have been. If a young man visited a young woman's home, it was almost always under the watchful eyes of her family. Though those eyes were not sharp or suspicious, just quietly observant as though measuring the passage of time more than the character of the visitor. The conversations were often plain and practical. The weather, the harvest, the travel of merchants, the small doings of animals around the village. Romance was not spoken aloud. It was something implied in the way someone passed a cup or shifted their chair slightly closer without comment. Songs of love did exist in the broader world, but in a small medieval village, love itself arrived with far less poetry. It came with the regularity of chores, woven into the steady pattern of days. If two people found that they did not mind working near each other, or that silence between them was a comfortable thing rather than an awkward one, that was often considered enough. Feelings did not flare like sudden sparks. They accumulated like soft layers of dust, settling into place without anyone noticing the moment when the room had changed. Sometimes a pair would walk among the market stalls on feast days, though the markets were never lively in the way stories later romanticized. The stalls held onions, cloth scraps, small wooden tools, simple pastries, and little else. Yet walking side by side through this modest display often felt like the nearest thing the village had to a true date. They would comment on the price of flour or discuss the merits of this vendor's honey over another. Those conversations were dull by design because nothing rushed in medieval life, especially not affection. Occasionally, a traveling minstrel would pass through, bringing tales of courtly love from places far beyond the village boundaries, castles, noble feasts, knights professing devotion to unattainable ladies. The villagers listened politely to the songs, letting the melodies drift into the night, but no one took them too seriously. Such stories felt like they belonged to a different world. The villagers' own version of dating lacked the dramatic sighs and bold declarations found in those songs. It was closer to waiting for bread to rise slow, predictable, and dependent on patience rather than passion. Even when two people finally agreed to marry, the moment seldom felt climactic. There were no dramatic proposals or sudden revelations. Instead, there was usually a conversation between families. A soft discussion at a long wooden table, the fire smoldering low in the hearth. Someone would suggest that the match seemed reasonable. Another would agree. No one raised their voice. No one cried or celebrated loudly. The couple themselves might sit quietly nearby, hands folded, perhaps stealing a glance at each other from time to time, but never in a way that would draw attention. In those days, love was not expected to be exciting. It was expected to be stable, long-lasting, and as ordinary as the gentle hum of a spinning wheel. People believed that affection deepened over years of shared tasks needing dough, tending fields, patching clothes, and surviving winters side by side. Dating was merely the earliest stage of that slow, steady companionship. And so the village continued on with this gentle, unhurried approach to relationships. Nothing about it was dramatic or surprising. The villagers woke with the sun, worked through the day, and sat by their hearths at night. Somewhere in those routines, small connections formed, softened, and eventually settled into something the villagers recognized as love. No one felt the need to define it or chase it. It simply happened when it happened, in the same quiet way bread browned in the oven or seasons changed without announcement. And as the years drifted by with the calm certainty of the turning wheel, the stories of medieval dating remained exactly what they had always been: slow, steady, uneventful, and woven into the quiet rhythm of life itself, where nothing rushed, nothing startled, and everything unfolded with the peaceful pace of a world that measured time not in moments of excitement, but in long stretched. As more seasons eased quietly across the village, even the idea of dating remained unchanged, shaped more by the rhythm of chores than by any conscious intention. Each spring brought the predictable pairing of tasks. People repaired roofs, tended fields, and cleaned tools, and in doing so they naturally crossed paths. A young man lifting thatch bundles might find himself working beside a young woman spreading seed. And though neither spoke much, the familiarity grew as steadily as the soil beneath their hands. It was not romance in the way later centuries imagined it. No sparks, no grand gestures, only small recognitions repeated over time until they felt as ordinary as the rising sun. During the long summer days, when the heat pressed gently on everything, the villagers moved more slowly still. The air shimmered above distant fields, and the soft buzzing of insects filled the empty spaces of conversation. Sometimes two young people would walk toward the river, not necessarily together, but often arriving at a similar hour, as if by coincidence. They might sit on opposite ends of a flat stone, watching the current move with the same unhurried pace as their own thoughts. It was common for them to speak very little. Words were as precious as any good and not wasted unless needed. Yet the simple act of sharing a quiet place was often noticed by those in the village, who would later mention it casually, not as gossip but as part of the daily account of who had gone where. Autumn brought a different kind of closeness. As the harvest season arrived, hands worked faster, but never with the urgency of later ages. The villagers bundled grain, gathered apples, stacked firewood, and sorted vegetables, often side by side. A person might spend hours working next to someone whose company they found tolerable or even pleasant, though they might not say it aloud. The steady sound of sighs, the rustle of hay, and the soft thud of vegetables landing in baskets formed a backdrop to courtship that unfolded without fanfare. Young people learned each other's rhythms as they worked, the pace of their steps, the way they carried tools, the quiet sighs they made when tired. These small understandings mattered more than spoken declarations. When winter finally descended, it wrapped the village in a kind of forced stillness. The snow lay thick on the rooftops, the winds hummed low against wooden eaves, and the nights stretched long. Families spent more time indoors, lingering by the hearth as the fire offered the only real warmth. If a young man visited a young woman's family during these cold months, the entire household would sit together, often in silence broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or the dwindling supply of dried turnips. Yet even in those quiet hours, something gentle unfolded, an acknowledgement that the presence of another provided a warmth of its own, subtle but steady. The flickering firelight cast soft shadows that made every gesture seem slower, more deliberate, and perhaps slightly more meaningful, though no one ever said so directly. In the surrounding villages, some only a half-day's walk away customs were similar. Mews traveled slowly, usually brought by a passing tinker or a shepherd who had wandered farther than usual. These travelers sometimes spoke of different traditions, dances held during feast days, gatherings where young people could mingle more freely, or customs in which a suitor presented a gift, such as a carved spoon or a small embroidered cloth. These stories were interesting, but the villagers rarely adopted such practices themselves. Change was something they approached cautiously, preferring the comfort of what had always been done. Even the idea of choosing someone felt different in medieval times. Practical matters often guided the decision more than feelings did. Families quietly considered which households were stable, who had access to decent land, who had space in their home, or who possessed useful skills. Marriage was not so much an expression of two people as emotions, as it was a joining of daily routines, combining labor and responsibilities in a way that made seasons easier to withstand. Dating, if it could be called that, was simply the slow, uneventful process of determining whether two people could live side by side without unsettling the balance of their households. On rare occasions, someone might feel a stronger emotion, something like fondness or longing, but such feelings were seldom spoken aloud. Emotional expression was considered a private matter, almost an indulgence. Instead, these feelings showed themselves in small actions: an extra log of firewood chopped, a basket of berries left discreetly at a doorstep, a slight smile exchanged across a room. These gestures were never explained or discussed. They simply existed, like the quiet morning mist that drifted through the fields. Even feast days, which were considered lively by medieval standards, unfolded with a kind of drowsy gentleness. The villagers gathered around long tables laden with bread, broth, cheese, and seasonal vegetables. People sang songs in low voices, clapped in rhythm, and occasionally danced in slow circles around the fire. If two people danced together, it was considered a sign of interest, but the dances were not fast or dramatic. They were steady, simple steps repeated endlessly, as if mirroring the unchanging patterns of daily life. Afterward, the villagers went home at a leisurely pace, making no assumptions about what the dance meant. Most matters of the heart were allowed to ripen slowly, sometimes taking years. The village matchmaker, an older woman whose memory stretched further than most, sometimes offered gentle suggestions. She never insisted, never pushed. Instead, she observed quietly from the edges of social gatherings, noting which pairs seemed comfortable in each other's presence. Her advice, when given, was usually vague. "You two seem to get along," or "he works steadily." "She has a calm way about her." Such simple statements were often enough to nudge families into quiet discussion. But even these discussions moved slowly. Nothing about medieval dating was hurried. And so, day by day, season by season, year by year, relationships formed in the same way bread dough rose, imperceptibly at first, then gradually, steadily, without surprise. Excitement was not something they sought, especially in matters of the heart. What they valued was steadiness, like the consistent turning of the mill wheel or the dependable glow of candles during the long winter nights. In this world, dating did not spark with sudden emotion. It settled gently, like silt drifting to the bottom of a quiet pond. And for the villagers who lived within the slow rhythm of medieval life, that quietness was not a flaw, it was the very essence of love itself. As the years passed with the same soft regularity, the villagers came to understand that dating, though they rarely used that word, was less about moments and more about patterns. It was the gentle pattern of seeing the same face during morning chores, or noticing the same pair of footsteps behind you on the long path to the fields. Such routines created a familiarity that required no explanation. The villagers trusted what repeated itself, because repetition was the truest measure of life in their world. Even the simplest daily tasks seemed to guide relationships in natural, almost unnoticed ways. The young people who gathered water from the well often timed their visits to avoid the busiest hours, and in doing so, they found themselves sharing the space with the same individuals time after time. The sound of water sloshing in wooden buckets echoed softly, and the stone walls of the well kept voices low. Any conversation that happened there was gentle and practical, discussing the weather, the quality of the water, or the slow repairs needed on the path leading back to the village. But beneath those plain words, something grew, a comfort in each other's company that made the long walk home feel less lonely. In the workshops scattered around the village, young apprentices learned their crafts under the watchful eyes of older masters. Whether they were weaving cloth, carving wood, shaping iron, or making soap, these apprentices sometimes found opportunities to help one another with small tasks. A young woman might bring a bundle of flax fibers to the weaver's shed at the same time every week. quietly aware that a young man she was fond of would be there preparing his shuttle. They never spoke of it, but the consistency of their shared moments carried more meaning than any spoken promise. In medieval life, silent patterns were often more expressive than words. Families, too, played their part simply by observing. They rarely intervened or encouraged openly. Such things were done with subtlety. If a family noticed that a young man consistently stopped by to help repair their fence each spring, or that a young woman often visited during harvest to exchange dried herbs, they quietly recognized these actions for what they were. Yet no one announced anything. They simply allowed the slow rhythm of life to suggest its own conclusions. The festivals that marked the turning of seasons provided occasional moments for young people to spend time together, though even these events were modest by later standards. On Midwinter's Eve, villagers gathered in the square to share warm broth and listen to the low hum of songs passed down through generations. There might be a fire at the center, burning steadily but without flare, and the villagers danced in slow, predictable circles around it. If two people danced near each other, hands brushing lightly, it was considered pleasant but not momentous. Such small touches lingered only as faint memories, to be thought of later during quieter moments by the hearth. Spring festivals were slightly livelier, though still subdued. When flowers bloomed and new grass softened the ground, villagers would gather in meadows just outside the village. They would lay blankets on the grass and share early berries, simple pastries, and milk warmed with honey. Young people walked through the meadow, occasionally picking flowers or braiding grass stems. If someone offered a braided grass cord to another, it was considered a gentle gesture of interest. But the exchange was so simple and unadorned that it carried no pressure. If the other person accepted it, the villagers might take quiet notice. If not, nothing changed. The slow rhythm of life continued on. Even the conversations that hinted at courtship were delivered with a calm, unhurried tone. A young man might remark, "Your family's goats seem to be thriving this spring," and the young woman would nod and reply something equally simple like, "They have had good grazing." Beneath these statements, an understanding formed. It was not that the villagers feared speaking more openly, they simply did not see the need. Feelings were expected to simmer gently over long stretches of time, not boil suddenly into declarations. The elders, sitting outdoors on wooden stools to catch the rare warmth of sun, often reflected on the courting customs of their youth. They told stories not of passionate romances, but of long walks taken in comfortable silence, or of shared tasks that eventually led to shared lives. They described how, after months or even years of these small interactions, a family might quietly ask another whether their children seemed suited to one another. These discussions were practical more than sentimental. Families considered whether the young people worked steadily, whether their tempers were even, and whether their skills would complement each other. Love, as it was understood then, grew after marriage rather than before. The idea of excitement rarely entered these conversations. Medieval life itself discouraged sudden intensities. The villagers were too familiar with the unpredictability of weather, illness, and harvests to welcome unpredictability in relationships as well. What they sought was steadiness, someone who could tend the animals without complaint, who would help gather firewood through the winter, who would share bread without counting each crumb. Romance, if it existed at all, was found in small acts repeated quietly over years. Sometimes young couples would walk to the outskirts of the village, where the fields met the edges of small forests. They would stand beneath trees whose branches moved gently in the wind, listening to the rustle of leaves. They rarely spoke of anything personal. Instead, they commented on the tracks of animals in the dirt or the new growth on nearby plants. But the very act of noticing these things together formed the foundation of affection. The villagers believed that companionship was made of shared observations rather than shared emotions. As the sun set each evening, casting soft orange light over the rooftops, the villagers returned to their homes, their days ending exactly as they had begun, quietly, predictably, without rush. Dating never demanded anything more from them. It fit seamlessly into their routines, requiring no change in pace and no heightened emotion. It was simply a natural extension of life's slow procession. And so the story of medieval dating unfolded as gently as everything else in their world, not through grand adventures or dramatic confessions, but through the steady accumulation of small, uneventful moments. Moments that drifted as softly as the smoke rising from their hearths, disappearing into the calm evening air, becoming part of the quiet tapestry of their lives. As winter turned once more into spring, the village slipped into its familiar rhythm with the calm certainty of a place untouched by haste. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of dark soil that promised another growing season. The pace of life picked up only slightly, just enough for the villagers to begin their yearly tasks again, but never enough to feel rushed. And in that gentle shift from cold to mild warmth, the subtle dance of medieval dating resumed without anyone announcing its beginning. Young people found themselves outside more often as the days lengthened. The paths that had been slick with ice now softened underfoot, making it easier to visit neighbors or walk to the edge of the fields. When two young villagers encountered one another during these strolls, they exchanged small nods or a quiet greeting. Sometimes they paused to discuss the condition of the thawing ground or the number of birds returning from the south. These brief conversations were rarely memorable, yet they formed the threads that eventually wove two lives together. In the orchards that bordered the village, apple trees began to show the first signs of budding. A few young couples walked there in the early mornings or late afternoons, when the sun rested low on the horizon and cast long shadows over the bare branches. They talked little, perhaps remarking on which trees seemed to have survived the winter best. The calmness of the orchard made their silences feel comfortable rather than awkward. It was said by the elders that if two people could stand together in silence without feeling the need to fill the air with words, they were well suited for marriage. And so these quiet walks served as a kind of unspoken test of compatibility. The river, too, played its role in the slow ritual of courtship. As the ice broke apart and drifted downstream, villagers gathered to watch the thaw. Young people often arrived around the same time, leaning on long wooden poles or simply standing with their hands folded. The sound of cracking ice and rushing water filled the space where conversation might have been. There was something soothing about this shared quiet, as though the river itself carried the weight of words so the villagers didn't have to. If a young man offered to help a young woman step over puddles or muddy patches near the riverbank, it was considered a polite but modest gesture, nothing that called attention to itself, yet such small efforts were remembered long afterward. The village market, held once a week, became livelier in the spring but remained humble. Stalls offered simple goods, bundles of herbs, small wooden carvings, woolen threads, and the earliest vegetables. Young people visited the stalls mostly to help their families, but inevitably, certain faces became familiar week after week. A young man selling firewood might notice a young woman examining cloth. A young woman trading eggs might catch sight of a young man carrying bundles of reeds. These glances, though fleeting, created a pattern, and villagers trusted patterns more than they trusted intentions. When two people crossed paths repeatedly in the market, it was taken as a quiet sign of compatibility, even if nothing was spoken. In the evenings, as the villagers returned home from their tasks, the hearth fires flickered back to life. Families gathered around wooden tables, eating simple meals of boiled grains, vegetables, or leftover salted meat. A young man visiting a household during these hours did so with the same calm ease that defined every part of medieval life. He might sit by the fire, not speaking much, simply warming his hands while the family talked among themselves. The young woman of the household might offer him bread or broth, and though the gesture was polite and modest, it held meaning. Hospitality had long been a quiet language of courtship. When the evenings stretched into night, the fire dimmed and conversations grew sparse. It was at these times that families often took measure of a suitor. They noted whether he seemed patient, whether he listened when others spoke, whether he carried the calm steadiness required to endure the slow, repetitive cycles of medieval daily life. Excitement was not valued, steadiness was. The parents of a young woman, seeing a young man sit peacefully by the hearth without impatience, felt reassured. They believed that such stillness would serve well in marriage. Sometimes when a young man walked home after one of these visits, the path ahead of him glowed faintly with moonlight. The village at night was quiet in a way that invited reflection. Houses were dark, except for the thin seams of firelight showing through shutters. The cold air carried the muffled sounds of livestock settling into sleep. And on these peaceful walks, a young man might think about the household he had visited, the young woman he had spoken to briefly, the warm greeting from her family. Yet even these thoughts were unhurried, slipping through his mind as gently as the breeze. The older villagers liked to say that love in their youth had been much the same. A slow accumulation of tiny moments, none of which seemed extraordinary on their own. They believed that a marriage rooted in such moments, quiet work shared over seasons, Small kindnesses offered without expectation was stronger than anything built on sudden feelings. And so they encouraged their children to trust the slow process of medieval courtship. Even festivals in late spring carried this restful quality. As daylight lingered longer and the air grew warmer, the villagers held gatherings in the open fields. They roasted simple foods over small fires, sang songs with low voices, and sometimes danced in groups, moving and repeating patterns that matched the unchanging rhythm of village life. If two young people danced near each other or exchanged a smile during one of the slower songs, it was noticed but never discussed openly. The villagers believed that too much attention spoiled the natural unfolding of affection. In the quiet moments after such gatherings, when the fires dimmed and the villagers walked back to their homes beneath the pale glow of moon and stars, something almost tender floated in the air. Not passion, not excitement, just a feeling of calm connection shared between people who had spent another season living, working, and growing alongside one another. The villagers, still half asleep from their long evening of idle chatter, returned to their usual routines with the same unchanging calmness that had filled generations before them. The blacksmith's apprentice swept the soot from the forge floor in soft, patient strokes, each movement producing a faint whisper of dust that drifted lazily in the air. Nothing needed to be rushed. In that medieval corner of the world, nothing ever truly was. Across the lane, the mill wheel continued its slow creaking turn over the waterway, as if it too felt the weight of centuries pressing gently upon it. The river didn't hurry either, it murmured in long, steady breaths carrying bits of leaves and twigs that glided past the bank like sleepy travelers on a journey they never planned. Inside the tavern, which still smelled faintly of last night's watered-down ale, the innkeeper began straightening the wooden stools with a quiet care. He placed each one exactly where it had always been, never considering a different arrangement, for change was something people of the time found unnecessary. The fireplace still held the ghost of last night's embers, glowing faintly under a thin veil of ash as if unsure whether to stay warm or drift into rest. A pair of travelers, though not particularly eager ones, ambled down the road with slow, plodding steps. Their cloaks were heavy with dew, and their expressions were mild, almost blank, as if the world around them moved at such a gentle pace that they saw no reason to be alert. They exchanged a few muted comments about the weather, which had remained the same for days, perhaps weeks. Cool mornings, mild afternoons, and evenings that settled softly over the land like a wool blanket. In the fields beyond the village, workers moved in steady, predictable rhythms. A farmer raked straw into a neat pile, pausing every now and then to stretch his back and observe the wide, pale sky. The crows perched along the fences didn't bother to caw. Even they seemed lulled by the slow pulse of the day. Nothing remarkable happened, and nothing was expected to. The simplicity of the moment was its own quiet anchor, holding everything in place, allowing the hours to drift on as though they were gently floating along the surface of a still pond. And in that peaceful sameness, the medieval world continued to breathe, unchanging, unhurried, and perfectly content in its timeless monotony. As the midday sun rose a little higher, though not much changed because of it, the village took on its usual hush. Even the animals moved with unhurried ease. A few hens wandered near the well, pecking at the ground without any urgency, while an old goat stood beside the fence, chewing thoughtfully as though lost in its simple, repetitive chewing for the rest of the afternoon. Near the edge of the settlement, the cobbler sat outside his workshop, mending a shoe with steady, deliberate motions. The gentle tapping of his hammer echoed faintly, not sharp enough to disturb anyone, but just enough to remind the village that small tasks still kept life moving. He paused occasionally, not out of fatigue, but because pausing felt natural, almost expected in a world where nothing pressed hard against the mind. A young shepherd led his small flock along the grassy slope beyond the village walls. The sheep grazed slowly, pausing for long stretches as if considering each blade of grass. The shepherd leaned on his staff and let the breeze drift past him. It wasn't strong nor cool nor warm, just present, like everything else that quietly existed without intention or urgency. Back at the tavern, the innkeeper finally lit a small fire, though even the flames seemed to rise in a calm, lazy fashion. They flickered softly, casting gentle shadows across the worn wooden floor. A patron or two wandered in, not because they had pressing reasons, but because entering the tavern after midday had become a habit passed from parent to child. They nodded at the innkeeper in that slow, familiar way people in small medieval villages often did, offering no conversation beyond a quiet greeting. Outside, the narrow dirt road lay still, marked only by the faint prints of earlier travelers who moved at the same slow pace as everyone else. A wooden cart rolled by, its wheels creaking in a long, drawn-out rhythm that blended seamlessly into the afternoon's quiet. The driver hummed a tune without melody, just a low murmur to accompany the cart's journey toward the next village, which was much the same as this one, and always would be. Even the sky seemed to settle into a soft stillness, hosting a few pale clouds that drifted without direction or purpose. And so the hours continued to unfold in their gentle, unremarkable pattern, carrying the village forward in the same steady way it had been carried for years, peaceful, predictable, and quietly wrapped in its own dull comfort. As the afternoon wore on, the village's pace remained unbroken. The blacksmith paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his motions deliberate and careful, then returned to shaping the horseshoes with quiet attention. Sparks drifted lazily from the hammer strikes, glowing for a moment before settling back into the ash-dark forge. No one hurried. The rhythm of the work was enough to mark the passing of time. In the fields, the farmers bent over their crops with slow, steady strokes. Some pulled weeds from the earth, others scattered seeds with gentle, even hands. The rhythm of planting was familiar and predictable, each movement repeating the same motions day after day. Occasionally, a young villager would pass by another, nodding politely or offering a quiet greeting. Words were few because none were necessary. Companionship in those moments was measured in presence, not conversation. The village children wandered in small groups, but even their play was measured and soft. They rolled hoops across the grass, tossing small sticks from one to another. Laughter, if it came at all, was quiet, filtered by the slow cadence of daily life. Sometimes a child would pause to watch a butterfly drift lazily by or to pick a single flower from the meadow. These small attentions, simple and uneventful, were the earliest forms of learning observation, the same skill that would later guide young adults through the careful, unhurried rituals of dating. By mid-afternoon, the sun lowered gently toward the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the village. The air cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from fireplaces where stew or bread simmered. Villagers moved toward their homes in the same measured pace, their steps echoing softly on the dirt paths. Even the animals seemed to follow the rhythm of the day. Chickens returned slowly to their coops, the goat rested by the fence, and the sheep meandered homeward without urgency. Some young couples, though still quiet, continued their slow acquaintance. They walked the edges of the orchards, leaning against trees while exchanging practical observations. Which tree had the most buds? Whether the soil was damp enough for planting, or how the weather seemed slightly warmer than the previous day. No words of love were needed. These small, repetitive observations were enough to build a gentle understanding that could last a lifetime. Medieval dating, in its quietest form, required patience above all else. At the village well, a few villagers drew water for the evening. Buckets clinked softly against the stone walls, mingling with the distant hum of wind through the trees. Sometimes a young man or woman paused, helping another lift a heavy pail or steady a rope. These simple gestures, done without fanfare, were often noted quietly by the families watching nearby. They were subtle signals of kindness and reliability, the foundation of medieval relationships. And as always, nothing was rushed. Everything was observed at its own gentle pace. By evening, the sky shifted to muted shades of orange and gray, and the first hints of twilight settled over the rooftops. Families returned indoors, lighting small fires in their hearths to chase away the chill. The smell of baking bread or simmering broth filled the cottages, a familiar and comforting aroma that signaled the close of another uneventful, predictable day. Even in moments of quiet reflection, villagers felt no need for excitement. The regularity of life itself was sufficient. As night fully settled, Lanterns glowed faintly in windows, casting soft circles of light on the streets. The village seemed almost suspended, wrapped in a calm that stretched across rooftops, fields, and meadows. Lovers, young and old, could walk side by side without saying much, feeling only the gentle rhythm of shared presence. This was the essence of medieval dating: steady, patient, unremarkable, and yet deeply sustaining in its quiet constancy. And so the village, like it had for countless seasons, continued to move through the gentle passage of time, offering the same slow, sleepy world for young hearts to explore. It was a world of soft patterns, quiet gestures, and enduring patience, a world where love, if it existed, existed in whispers and in the unhurried rhythm of everyday life. As night deepened, the village settled fully into its quiet routine. The wind whispered gently through the trees, rustling the leaves in a slow, repetitive rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the village itself. Even the animals had paused their movements. The sheep huddled near the fence. The goat rested under a low-hanging branch, and the chickens had tucked themselves into their coops. The world seemed to breathe in a single, unhurried cadence. Inside the cottages, fires crackled softly, though rarely enough to disturb the calm. Families gathered near the hearth, speaking in low, measured voices or sometimes not at all. Occasionally, a young man or woman would exchange polite greetings with someone passing by the doorway, but even these encounters were subdued, almost ceremonial. Medieval dating rarely demanded anything more than this quiet attention, and the villagers had learned to find satisfaction in the simplest of gestures. Some young couples walked together along the dirt paths that led to the village center. They moved slowly, keeping pace with each other, rarely speaking more than necessary. Perhaps they commented on the moon rising over the fields, or the distant glow of a lantern in another cottage. Sometimes they simply walked, letting the rhythm of their steps and the calm of the night provide companionship. It was a gentle form of courtship, built on the patience of shared silence rather than the heat of emotion. In the outskirts of the village, the blacksmith finished his day's work, setting aside tools with careful precision. The soft clink of hammer and tongs subsided, replaced by the distant murmur of the river as it wound its slow way past the fields. The sound was steady, unremarkable, and comforting like the pulse of life itself. The blacksmith watched the moon reflect off the water for a moment, then returned to his modest home without haste, knowing tomorrow would offer the same slow, unchanging routine. Inside other cottages, the day's work was complete. The laundry hung to dry by the hearth's heat. Wool was spun into neat skeins, and bread had cooled to a steady warmth. Children yawned quietly in corners, their games long paused, their energy spent in ways that had never needed excitement to be satisfying. The adults watched them with faint, unhurried attention, content that the cycles of life continued as they always had. Even in the larger village spaces, nothing moved quickly. The market stalls had long since closed, and the few travelers passing through made their way, slowly observing the same sights they had already seen. The same wooden fences, the same low-roofed cottages, the same patterns of smoke rising from chimneys. The repetition of it all was soothing rather than tedious, and it gave young villagers ample opportunity to notice small, subtle patterns in the lives of those around them, patterns that might eventually guide the quiet formation of relationships. Courting in this medieval village was a process measured not by passion but by familiarity. A young woman might observe a young man tending the animals with careful attention, or a young man might notice a young woman mending clothes by the hearth. These small gestures, repeated over weeks or months, were the foundation of affection. Families watched without intrusion, and the village as a whole seemed to hum with the gentle knowledge that everything happened in its proper time. Nothing was hurried, and nothing needed to be. By the time the villagers retired to their beds, the night had grown thick and soft, blanketing the village in a calm, muted darkness. Fires and hearths had dwindled to gentle embers, and the wind carried only the faintest sounds of movement through the trees. Lovers rested in the same quiet spaces they had shared throughout the day, hands sometimes brushing, sometimes simply resting in proximity, yet always in harmony with the unhurried rhythm of life. And so, as another day ended with nothing remarkable to note, the village settled further into the slow, endless passage of time. Here, in this world of patience and repetition, medieval dating unfolded naturally, quietly, and predictably. It was a process of small gestures, of long silences that were understood rather than filled, of steady companionship nurtured over seasons rather than sudden emotion. And it was precisely this gentle, unchanging rhythm that allowed life to continue. Day after day, in the same sleepy, peaceful way that would stretch on for generations. As the first light of dawn stretched over the village, it arrived not with brilliance or urgency, but with a soft, gradual glow that touched the rooftops and fields alike. Villagers began their routines without haste, moving quietly through the still air as if the world itself were reluctant to awaken fully. Chickens wandered lazily from coop to yard, the goat lifted its head only to chew thoughtfully, and the river reflected the softening light with gentle ripples. It was the kind of morning that required no excitement, and the villagers were content with its calmness. The young people, who had spent the night in quiet companionship, now rose and carried out their morning chores. One might carry water from the well, another sweep the cottage floor with measured, deliberate strokes. Occasionally, they crossed paths along the narrow dirt lanes, exchanging the same faint nods and soft greetings that had become habitual over many months. These repeated encounters formed the core of medieval courtship, a quiet, steady familiarity rather than dramatic emotion. In the fields, farmers bent once more to the daily rhythm of planting and tending. They moved in slow, repetitive patterns, loosening soil, scattering seed, and patting it gently into place. Their hands knew the motions from years of repetition, and the young villagers learned alongside them, observing the steady diligence of work and absorbing the subtle lesson that patience and consistency mattered more than any sudden passion. Occasionally, a young man might glance at a young woman bending beside him, noting the precision of her movements or the calmness of her expression. But these observations were quiet, unspoken, and absorbed slowly, like the sun climbing over the distant hills. Near the village well, the usual few gathered again. Buckets clinked softly against the stone walls, and water sloshed in gentle waves as it was drawn from the depths. A young woman might help steady a rope, and a young man might return the favor without a word. These tiny acts, repeated over time, were more significant than words in this world. Families watching from nearby doorways noted these interactions with mild interest, seeing in them the early threads of potential companionship. There was no rush, no drama, only the slow, careful unfolding of life. By midday, the village had assumed its predictable rhythm once again. The blacksmith hammered quietly at his forge, sparks drifting lazily into the air. Children wandered the streets, their steps slow and deliberate, playing muted games of hoops or tossing sticks. The older villagers moved among them in measured steps, observing without comment, allowing the patterns of the day to unfold without interference. Even the sun seemed to move more slowly here, lingering in a soft haze rather than blazing down with urgency. In the outskirts of the village, small gatherings occurred, neighbors exchanging vegetables. A brief discussion of the weather, the slow repair of a fence. Young couples sometimes walked together in these quieter areas, commenting in muted tones about which fences might need mending or which herbs seemed healthy enough to pick. These practical observations served as gentle markers of affection. Love was not spoken aloud in this village. It was discovered in small, repetitive gestures and quiet attentions. As afternoon turned toward evening, shadows lengthened across the dirt roads and fields. The villagers began returning to their homes, carrying with them the gentle fatigue of hours spent in repetition. Fires were lit in hearths, and the aroma of simple meals, boiled grains, vegetables, bread filled the cottages. Young people, having spent the day observing and participating in familiar routines, now rested near their families or walked together in slow silence, letting the calm of the evening carry them forward. There was comfort in this steady companionship, a quiet understanding that grew with each repeated encounter and subtle act of care. And so, as twilight fell, the village was wrapped once more in its slow, unchanging rhythm. Lanterns glowed faintly in the windows, the wind moved gently through the trees, and the world seemed to sigh in quiet contentment. Medieval dating, in this sleepy corner of time, existed as a series of small, repeated patterns, each unnoticed, yet meaningful. It was steady, unhurried, and entirely ordinary, yet it provided the foundation for the lives that would unfold within this calm, predictable rhythm for generations to come. Night once again settled over the village like a soft blanket, and the world seemed to exhale in quiet relief. The fire in the inn's hearth glowed dimly, casting long, lazy shadows across the wooden floor. A few villagers lingered inside, speaking in low, measured tones about trivial matters, the state of the roads, the weather, the few coins earned at the market earlier that day. Nothing demanded urgency and nothing inspired excitement. The hours passed slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had been tamed by the predictable rhythm of medieval life. Young couples, still moving through the gentle patterns of courtship, sometimes wandered the quiet lanes together. They spoke in hushed voices, commenting on the moon rising over the distant fields or the way the smoke curled softly from chimneys. Occasionally, hands brushed, though never in a dramatic or conspicuous way. In this world, gestures mattered more than words, and subtlety was considered far more significant than showiness. The quiet consistency of presence, repeated day after day, was the language of medieval affection. Inside the cottages, families gathered near the hearth, tending the final embers of the evening fire. The smell of warmed bread or boiled vegetables filled the rooms, mingling with the faint aroma of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Children sat quietly in corners, folding their legs and watching the flames dance, or resting their heads against wooden benches as their parents went about small, careful tasks. The calm of the night encouraged stillness, and the villagers accepted it without question. This slow, predictable pace was how life had always unfolded, and it was enough. By midnight, the village had become nearly silent. Only the faint creaking of a distant mill wheel and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees disturbed the stillness. Those young villagers who had not yet retired to bed wandered slowly along the edges of the fields, sometimes observing the river's gentle flow or the faint glow of a lantern in another cottage. Even in these quiet walks, there was a sense of companionship, a shared presence that required no conversation or declaration of emotion. It was enough to simply be there, moving at the same steady pace as everyone else. The elders, sitting in their quiet rooms, reflected on the steady passage of time. They remembered their own youth-long hours spent in repetitive chores, days marked more by work than by emotion, weeks measured in practical milestones rather than excitement. Yet in all that monotony, there had been connections, small, subtle, and steady. That, they believed, was the true essence of medieval dating. Love, if it existed, grew slowly, nurtured by familiarity and repeated kindnesses rather than sudden feelings. And so they encouraged the younger generation to trust in the same slow rhythm. In the cold early hours before dawn, the village rested. Roofs creaked softly in the wind, the river murmured in gentle cadence, and the animals slept soundly. The world itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in quiet anticipation of the new day, which would unfold in the same unremarkable yet comforting way as the last. And in that stillness, young hearts moved through their small, repeated gestures, learning that love was not hurried or urgent, but patient, steady, and entirely ordinary. The rhythm of life continued, day after day, season after season, unbroken and unwavering. Medieval dating remained slow and deliberate, filled with gentle glances, quiet gestures, and the comfort of shared silences. It was a process that required no drama, no passion, no sudden declarations, only patience, attentiveness, and the enduring patterns of ordinary existence. And in that calm, unchanging world, the village slept, loved, and lived exactly as it had for countless generations.